They say marriage is about growing old together, but sometimes one person grows while the other simply grows apart. My name is Linda Morrison, and for 40 years I believed that love, loyalty, and sacrifice would be enough to keep my marriage strong. I was devastatingly wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I discovered my husband's betrayal wasn't dramatic, like in the movies. There was no passionate confrontation, no lipstick on his collar, no mysterious phone calls in the middle of the night. Instead, it was a quiet Tuesday morning when I walked into his office to surprise him with his favorite coffee and homemade blueberry muffins, only to find him and his 28-year-old secretary, Ashley Rodriguez, in a position that shattered 40 years of trust in an instant. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. The real turning point came 3 weeks later when Thomas looked me straight in the eye and said, "Linda, I'm done pretending. Ashley makes me feel alive again. You've become more like a roommate than a wife, and frankly, I deserve better at this stage of my life." Those words didn't just break my heart. They ignited something inside me that had been dormant for decades. If Thomas thought he could discard me like an old piece of furniture after I'd spent 4 decades building his dreams alongside my own, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. What happened next not only changed my life forever, but also taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. The foundation of my story begins in Riverside Heights, Oregon, a city where the Columbia River winds through downtown, and the mountains provide a backdrop that makes you believe anything is possible. I met Thomas Morrison in 1983 at a community fundraiser for the local library. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration, and he was 24, ambitious and charming in a way that made my heart skip when he smiled. Thomas had just started his construction company, Morrison & Associates, with nothing but a beat-up pickup truck, a toolbox inherited from his father, and dreams bigger than the sky. I was working as an administrative assistant at a local bank, living in a tiny studio apartment and saving every penny I could. When Thomas asked me to dance that night, I never imagined I was dancing with my future husband, business partner, and eventually, the man who would teach me the hardest lesson of my life. Our courtship was everything a small-town romance should be. Thomas would pick me up after work in his dusty truck, and we'd drive to the riverfront where he'd share his visions of building not just houses, but entire communities. He spoke with such passion about creating homes where families would grow and thrive, about being part of something that would last long after we were gone. I fell in love not just with Thomas, but with his dreams, his ambition, and the way he made me feel like an essential part of something important. We married in 1984 in a small ceremony at St. Michael's Church, with my parents, his sister Carol, and about 50 of our closest friends and family members in attendance. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and Thomas wore a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion. It was the first new suit he'd owned since high school graduation, and I remember thinking how handsome he looked, how proud I was to be marrying this man who worked with his hands and dreamed with his heart. The early years of our marriage were a blur of 18-hour days, shared dreams, and the kind of teamwork that made me believe we were invincible together. While Thomas was out on job sites, swinging hammers and pouring foundations, I was handling the business side of Morrison and Associates from our kitchen table. I managed the books, scheduled appointments, handled client communications, and even helped with payroll when we finally had enough employees to require one. I remember those first few years so vividly because they were filled with a sense of purpose and partnership that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. We'd eat dinner together every night, sharing stories about our day, planning for the future, and dreaming about the family we hoped to have. Thomas would come home covered in sawdust and concrete, and I'd have his favorite meal waiting, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, or his mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings that I'd learned to make just the way he liked it. By 1987, Morrison and Associates had grown from Thomas and 2 part-time helpers to a company employing 12 people full-time. We'd moved from our kitchen table to a small office space downtown, and I'd officially become the company's office manager, though I was still doing the work of an accountant, secretary, and human resources director, all rolled into one. Thomas often joked that I was the backbone of the company, and I believed him. I felt valued, needed, and essential to everything we were building together. It was around this time that we began seriously trying to start a family. Month after month, we hoped and prayed, but children never came for us. After 2 years of trying and several consultations with specialists, we learned that I had fertility issues that would make natural conception extremely difficult. The news devastated both of us, but in different ways. Thomas threw himself into work with even more intensity, while I struggled with feelings of inadequacy and failure that I carried silently for months. The fertility treatments were expensive, emotionally draining, and ultimately unsuccessful. After 3 years of procedures, hormones, and disappointments, we made the difficult decision to stop trying. Thomas suggested we look into adoption, but I was emotionally exhausted and asked for time to heal before we explored that option. That time stretched into years, and somehow we never found our way back to the conversation about children. Instead, Morrison and Associates became our baby. We poured all of our parental energy into nurturing and growing the company. By the mid-1990s, we had 25 employees and had expanded into commercial construction projects. We built shopping centers, office buildings, and even a small hospital wing. Thomas was gaining recognition in the industry, and I was managing an increasingly complex business operation. I handled everything from contracts and scheduling to employee relations and client communications. When Thomas was out schmoozing with potential clients or visiting job sites, I was in the office making sure everything ran smoothly. I coordinated with architects, negotiated with suppliers, managed cash flow, and solved problems before Thomas even knew they existed. The company's success was as much mine as it was his, though Thomas's name was the only one on the door. As the company grew, so did our lifestyle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We moved from our starter home to a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Willowbrook, one of Riverside Heights' most desirable neighborhoods. The house sat on 2 acres with mature oak trees and a view of the mountains that took my breath away every morning. We joined the Cedar Valley Country Club, took vacations to Hawaii and Europe, and began collecting the kinds of possessions that signaled success in our community. But somewhere along the way, our marriage began to shift in ways I didn't recognize at the time. Thomas spent more and more time at the office or entertaining clients, while I managed the home front and kept the business running smoothly. Our conversations became more focused on logistics and less on dreams. We still functioned well as business partners, but as husband and wife, we were slowly drifting into separate orbits. By the early 2000s, Thomas had begun hiring additional office staff to help manage the growing administrative demands of the company. First came Janet, an experienced bookkeeper who took over some of my financial responsibilities. Then Marcus, a project manager who helped coordinate the larger commercial jobs. Finally, in 2003, Thomas hired Ashley Rodriguez as his personal secretary. Ashley was 21 when she joined Morrison and Associates, fresh out of community college with a certificate in business administration and an enthusiasm that reminded me of myself 20 years earlier. She was beautiful in an understated way, with dark hair that she wore in a professional bun and brown eyes that lit up when she smiled. She was also smart, organized, and eager to learn everything about the construction business. Initially, I was grateful for Ashley's help. She handled Thomas's calendar, managed his correspondence, and took care of the countless details that kept him organized and on schedule. This freed me up to focus on higher-level business operations and gave me the time I'd been craving to pursue some personal interests I'd neglected for years. I began volunteering at Pinewood Medical Center, helping elderly patients navigate insurance paperwork and Medicare claims. I also joined a book club at the local library and started taking evening art classes at the community college. For the first time in years, I felt like I was developing aspects of myself that had nothing to do with Thomas or the company. Thomas seemed pleased with these changes in my life. He often commented on how good it was to see me pursuing my own interests, how proud he was that I was branching out and finding fulfillment beyond our business. He encouraged me to spend time with my friends, to take weekend trips with my sister-in-law Carol, and to continue expanding my volunteer work. What I didn't realize at the time was that my increased independence was creating space in our marriage that Ashley was gradually filling. She began staying late to help Thomas with evening meetings. She accompanied him to client dinners when I was busy with my volunteer commitments. She traveled with him to construction trade shows and industry conferences, handling the logistics, and serving as his professional companion. The changes were so gradual that I didn't notice the warning signs until much later. Thomas and Ashley's professional relationship was evolving into something more personal, but it happened so slowly that it never triggered my alarm bells. They developed inside jokes about difficult clients and shared references to industry events I hadn't attended. They began working more closely together on project proposals and presentations, spending hours reviewing plans and strategies. By 2015, Ashley had been with the company for 12 years and had grown from a young secretary into Thomas's trusted right-hand person. She knew his preferences better than I did, anticipated his needs before he voiced them, and had become indispensable to his daily operations. She was also no longer the 21-year-old college graduate who had started with us. At 33, she had grown into a confident, capable woman who commanded respect from clients and employees alike. I began to notice subtle changes in Thomas's behavior around this time. He became more conscious of his appearance, upgrading his wardrobe and starting a workout routine he claimed was for his health. He began working longer hours and traveling more frequently for business. He also became more critical of me, making comments about my appearance, my habits, and my contributions to the company that stung more than I wanted to admit. When I mentioned these changes to my best friend Pat Williams, she suggested that Thomas might be going through a midlife crisis. Men his age often start questioning everything, she said over coffee one afternoon. He's probably just feeling the pressure of turning 60 and wondering what he's accomplished with his life. Her explanation made sense, and I tried to be patient and supportive while Thomas worked through whatever internal struggles he was facing. I made efforts to reconnect with my husband, planning romantic dinners and weekend getaways, and trying to rekindle the intimacy that had slowly faded from our marriage. Sometimes Thomas seemed receptive to these efforts, but more often he appeared distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere even when his body was present. I blamed the stress of running a successful business and tried to be understanding about the demands on his time and attention. The first real crack in my denial came in early 2018 when I walked into Thomas's office one evening to find him and Ashley working late on a presentation for a major client. They were standing close together, reviewing documents spread across his desk, and when I entered, they stepped apart with a quickness that seemed telling. Ashley's face flushed slightly, and Thomas's greeting was overly casual, as if he was trying too hard to appear normal. "Linda, what brings you by so late?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a tone I couldn't quite identify. "I thought you were at your book club meeting." "It ended early," I replied, studying their faces for clues about what I might have interrupted. "I thought I'd see if you needed anything before I headed home." Ashley busied herself gathering papers, avoiding eye contact. "I should get going," she said quickly. "We can finish this tomorrow morning, Mr. Morrison." "Of course," Thomas replied, his voice still carrying that strange, too casual tone. Thanks for staying late to help with the Riverside Mall proposal." As Ashley hurried out of the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked in on something significant, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The professional explanation made perfect sense. They were working on an important presentation that required extra time and attention. But the way they had moved apart when I entered, the flush on Ashley's face, and the awkwardness in Thomas's voice all suggested something more personal had been happening. I pushed these concerns aside, telling myself I was being paranoid and suspicious without cause. Thomas and Ashley had worked closely together for 15 years. It was natural that they would have developed a comfortable working relationship. I was probably misreading the situation, projecting my own insecurities onto an innocent professional interaction. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the following months, I found myself paying closer attention to the dynamics between Thomas and Ashley. I noticed how her face lit up when he entered a room, how she laughed just a little too enthusiastically at his jokes, and how she seemed to find excuses to touch his arm or shoulder during conversations. I also noticed how Thomas's demeanor changed when Ashley was around. He became more animated, more engaged, more like the charming man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The realization was gradual and painful. My husband was having an emotional affair with his secretary, and possibly a physical one as well. The signs were all there once I knew what to look for. The late-night work sessions, the business trips that seemed to require both of them, the way they communicated with looks and gestures that excluded everyone else in the room. For months, I wrestled with what to do with this knowledge. Part of me wanted to confront Thomas directly, to demand answers and force him to choose between his marriage and whatever was happening with Ashley. Another part of me hoped that if I ignored the situation, it would resolve itself naturally. Maybe Thomas was just going through a phase, enjoying the attention of a younger woman, but ultimately committed to our marriage and our life together. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that 40 years of marriage was too much, to throw away over suspicions and circumstantial evidence. I reminded myself of all the good times Thomas and I had shared, all the dreams we had built together, and all the reasons we had fallen in love in the first place. Surely those decades of shared history counted for something. Surely the man I had loved for so long wouldn't betray me in such a fundamental way. But deep down, I knew the truth. My marriage was over, even if the official end hadn't been declared yet. Thomas had already made his choice, and it wasn't me. The only question was whether he would have the courage to admit it, or whether I would have to force the issue myself. The answer came on that quiet Tuesday morning in March 2019, when I decided to surprise Thomas with his favorite coffee and homemade blueberry muffins. I had taken extra care with the muffins, using fresh berries and the recipe his mother had taught me decades earlier. I thought it would be a nice gesture, a small way to show him that I still cared and was still thinking about the little things that made him happy. The office was quiet when I arrived, earlier than usual because I had gotten up before dawn to bake. Most of the staff wouldn't arrive for another hour, and I expected to find Thomas alone, reviewing project plans or catching up on correspondence. Instead, I found him and Ashley in an embrace that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't hear me enter. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching my husband of 40 years hold another woman with a tenderness and passion that had been absent from our marriage for longer than I cared to admit. In that moment, all of my suspicions and fears crystallized into devastating certainty. I cleared my throat softly, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. Ashley's face went pale, and Thomas's expression cycled through shock, guilt, and finally, a kind of defensive anger that I had never seen before. "Linda," he said, his voice strained. "I can explain." But I didn't want explanations. I didn't want to hear about how it had started innocently, how they had tried to resist their feelings, or how sorry they were that I had found out this way. I simply set the coffee and muffins on his desk, looked him in the eye, and said, "When you're ready to talk honestly about what happens next, I'll be at home." Then I turned and walked out of the office, my heart pounding and my mind racing with the implications of what I had just witnessed. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of building a life together, 40 years of believing that love and commitment would be enough to weather any storm. All of it had just crumbled in an instant. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside Heights, I realized that this moment had been coming for a long time. The signs had been there for years, but I had chosen to ignore them, hoping that my loyalty and dedication would be enough to save our marriage. Now I knew that some things couldn't be saved, no matter how much you loved them or how hard you were willing to fight. The question now was what came next. How do you rebuild your life at 62 after 40 years of marriage? How do you start over when everything you thought you knew about your future has been torn away? How do you find the strength to face each new day when the person you trusted most in the world has betrayed you in the most fundamental way possible? I didn't have answers to these questions yet, but as I pulled into the driveway of the house Thomas and I had shared for over 2 decades, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened next, I would not allow myself to be dismissed or discarded. I had spent 40 years helping to build something extraordinary, and I deserved better than to be cast aside like an outdated piece of equipment. Thomas Morrison was about to learn that the woman he had underestimated for so long was far stronger, far smarter, and far more determined than he had ever imagined. The game was just beginning, and I intended to win. The 3 weeks that followed my discovery were a masterclass in emotional torture. Thomas came home that evening acting as if nothing had happened, chatting about his day and asking about my volunteer work at the medical center. I played along, serving dinner and making conversation while inside I felt like I was dying a slow, agonizing death. Ashley called in sick for the rest of that week. Thomas claimed she had caught some kind of flu, but I knew better. She was avoiding the inevitable confrontation, buying time to figure out how to handle the situation. Meanwhile, I was left to process the devastation of my marriage's betrayal while pretending everything was normal. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I lost 8 pounds in those first 2 weeks, something Thomas noticed but attributed to stress from my volunteer work. "You're doing too much at the hospital," he said one morning over coffee, his voice carrying the same tone of casual concern he might use with a business acquaintance. "Maybe you should cut back on your hours there." The irony was suffocating. Here was my husband of 40 years, expressing concern for my well-being while simultaneously conducting an affair that was destroying me from the inside out. I wanted to scream, to throw my coffee cup at his head, to demand answers and explanations. Instead, I nodded and said I'd consider reducing my volunteer commitments. During those long, sleepless nights, I found myself replaying our entire marriage, looking for clues I had missed. When had Thomas stopped loving me? When had I become invisible to him? When had our partnership transformed from genuine collaboration to mere convenience? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, eating away at every happy memory I thought we had shared. I remembered our 10th anniversary dinner, when Thomas had raised his wine glass and said, "To my beautiful wife, who makes everything I accomplish possible." Had he meant it then, or had it been empty words even at that point? I remembered our 20th anniversary trip to Paris, walking hand in hand along the Seine while Thomas pointed out buildings and talked about architectural details that fascinated him. Had he been genuinely happy, or had he already begun to see me as a burden? By the second week, I realized I needed help processing what I was going through. I made an appointment with Helen Grant, a therapist I'd heard good things about from other women at the medical center. Dr. Grant's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that made it easy to open up about painful subjects. Betrayal after 40 years of marriage is particularly devastating, Dr. Grant explained during our first session. You're not just grieving the loss of your relationship as it was, but also the loss of your future as you had imagined it. Everything you thought you knew about your life has been called into question. She was right. The affair wasn't just about Thomas choosing another woman over me. It was about the complete destruction of the narrative I had built my entire adult life around. I had seen myself as half of a successful partnership, both personally and professionally. Now I felt like I had been living a lie for years, possibly decades. "What did you sacrifice to build this partnership?" Dr. Grant asked during our second session. The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I had never fully acknowledged the scope of what I had given up. I had sacrificed my own career ambitions to support Thomas's dreams. Fresh out of college, I had been offered a position at a prestigious accounting firm in Portland, but I had turned it down to stay in Riverside Heights and help Thomas build his company. I had sacrificed my desire for children, not just because of the fertility issues, but because Thomas had always found reasons to postpone adoption discussions. The timing was never quite right. The business always needed more attention. There was always another goal to achieve first. I had sacrificed friendships, declining social invitations because Thomas needed me to work late or because we had business obligations that took precedence. I had sacrificed hobbies and interests, putting aside my love of painting and photography because there was always something more pressing that required my attention. I had sacrificed my own identity, becoming known primarily as Thomas Morrison's wife, rather than as Linda Morrison, a capable professional in her own right. Most painfully, I realized I had sacrificed my sense of self-worth, gradually accepting Thomas's subtle criticisms and dismissive comments as accurate assessments of my value. When had I stopped believing I deserved respect and appreciation? When had I started accepting crumbs of affection as sufficient nourishment for my emotional needs? The financial picture was equally troubling. While Morrison and Associates was worth several $1,000,000 on paper, I discovered that most of our assets were tied up in the business or in investments that Thomas controlled. Our house was in both our names, but the business accounts, the investment portfolios, and even our personal savings were structured in ways that gave Thomas primary control. I had been so focused on supporting the business and trusting Thomas to handle our financial planning that I had never insisted on having equal access to our accounts or equal say in our investment decisions. This realization I understood finances better than Thomas did, yet I had allowed him to take control of our personal wealth while I focused on the day-to-day operations of the business. During my third session with Dr. Grant, I confided my growing concern about my financial vulnerability. "I've put 40 years of my life into building something that legally belongs primarily to Thomas," I said, tears of frustration streaming down my face. "If he divorces me, I could lose everything I've worked for." Dr. Grant leaned forward in her chair. "Linda, you need to understand something very important. You're not a victim in this situation unless you choose to be. You have knowledge, skills, and 40 years of experience in the construction industry. You have relationships with clients, suppliers, and employees. You have assets and legal rights that can be protected. But you need to start thinking strategically instead of just emotionally." Her words were a wake-up call. I had been wallowing in grief and self-pity, but I hadn't been thinking about how to protect myself or plan for my future. I was 62 years old, not 22. I had decades of business experience and a track record of success. I wasn't helpless, even if I felt that way in the aftermath of discovering Thomas's betrayal. That weekend, while Thomas was supposedly playing golf with clients, I drove to the office to retrieve some financial documents I wanted to review. I still had my key and knew the security codes, though I wondered how much longer that would be the case. The building was empty except for the weekend cleaning crew, giving me the privacy I needed to conduct my own investigation. What I discovered in Thomas's files was both shocking and illuminating. Morrison and Associates was more successful than I had realized, with annual revenues exceeding $8 million and a client base that included some of the largest developers in the Pacific Northwest. But Thomas had also been making financial decisions without consulting me, including taking on significant debt to fund expansion projects and entering into partnership agreements that I knew nothing about. More disturbing were the personal expenses he had been charging to the company: expensive dinners, hotel stays, and travel expenses that clearly involved Ashley, but were being written off as business entertainment. He had also been paying Ashley significantly more than her job duties warranted, giving her raises and bonuses that seemed designed to ensure her loyalty and silence. I spent 4 hours in that office, copying files and taking notes, building a comprehensive picture of our financial situation. By the time I left, I had a much clearer understanding of what I was facing and what I would need to do to protect myself. I also had the beginnings of a plan that was both audacious and completely justified. The final confrontation came 3 days later, on a rainy Thursday evening in late March. Thomas had been working late again, supposedly meeting with architects about a new project. When he came home after 10 o'clock, I was waiting for him in our living room with a stack of documents spread across the coffee table. "We need to talk," I said simply, gesturing to the chair across from me. "And this time, I want the truth." Thomas looked at the documents, and I saw recognition flash across his face. He knew I had been in his office, knew I had discovered more than just his affair with Ashley. For a moment, I thought he might try to deny everything or make excuses. Instead, he sank into the chair and rubbed his face with his hands. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "About Ashley? Since I walked in on you 2 weeks ago? About the financial irregularities? Since this weekend?" I kept my voice steady, professional. "What I want to know is how long you've been planning to leave me, and what you thought would happen to me when you did." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of guilt and defiance. "I never meant for it to happen this way, Linda. Ashley and we tried to keep things professional for years, but we have a connection that you and I haven't had in a long time." The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. 40 years of marriage dismissed as lacking connection, as if our partnership had been nothing more than a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "And what about our marriage vows?" I asked. "What about the life we built together?" "We built a business together," Thomas corrected. "But our marriage has been over for years, Linda. We've been roommates, not lovers. We don't laugh together anymore. We don't dream together. We don't even really talk anymore unless it's about scheduling or logistics." His assessment stung because it contained elements of truth. Our marriage had become routine, comfortable, but not passionate. But I had always assumed that was normal after 4 decades together, that deep affection and mutual respect could sustain us through the inevitable changes that came with age and familiarity. "So your solution was to have an affair with your secretary and plan to abandon me without any discussion or consideration of how we might work on our problems together?" I asked. Thomas's face hardened. "Don't make me the villain here, Linda. You've been checked out of this marriage for years." 2. When was the last time you made an effort to be attractive to me? When was the last time you showed any real interest in my thoughts or feelings? You've been perfectly content to live like business partners instead of husband and wife. The way? Blame shifting was breathtaking in its audacity, but it also clarified something important for me. This wasn't a man who was genuinely remorseful about betraying our marriage. This was a man who had already justified his actions and was prepared to make me responsible for his choices. "I see," I said calmly. "So in your mind, I'm responsible for your affair because I didn't try hard enough to keep you interested." "That's not what I said," Thomas protested, but his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. I gathered the documents from the coffee table and stood up. Well, Thomas, since you've already decided our marriage is over and you've found someone who makes you feel more alive, I suppose we should discuss the practical details of ending our partnership. Something in my tone must have alerted him to danger because his expression sharpened. What kind of practical details? Divorce, obviously. Division of assets. Your plans for the business. My plans for the future. I kept my voice matter of fact, as if we were discussing a routine business transaction. I assume you'll want to buy out my interest in Morrison and Associates so you can continue running it with Ashley. Thomas relaxed slightly, apparently relieved that I was being reasonable about the business implications. Actually, Linda, I've been thinking about that. You've never had an official ownership stake in the company. Your name isn't on the incorporation, papers, or the major contracts. Legally, Morrison and Associates is my company. The casualness with which he delivered this devastating blow was almost impressive. 40 years of my life, 40 years of building a business from nothing, 40 years of sacrifice and dedication, dismissed with a legal technicality. I had known this moment would come, but experiencing it was still shocking. I see, I said, again my voice betraying none of the rage that was building inside me. So your plan is to divorce me, keep the business that I helped build, and leave me with whatever scraps the court decides I'm entitled to as your discarded wife. You'll get half the house, probably some alimony, Thomas said, as if he were being generous. And you're young enough to start over, build something new for yourself. Young enough at 62 to start over with nothing after 40 years of building someone else's dream. The condescension was infuriating, but I maintained my composure. When do you want me to move out? I asked. Thomas looked surprised by my calm acceptance. You don't have to move out immediately. We can be civilized about this. Maybe you could stay in the guest room until you find your own place. Until I found my own place, as if the house we had shared for 20 years was his house, as if I were a temporary guest who had overstayed her welcome. The assumption that I would simply accept this arrangement, that I would quietly disappear from his life while he continued to enjoy the fruits of our joint labor, revealed exactly how little he thought of me. That's very generous of you, I said, my voice dripping with false gratitude. I'll start making arrangements right away. As I headed toward the stairs, Thomas called after me. Linda, I hope we can stay friends through this. I hope you can understand that sometimes people grow apart, and it's better to end things amicably than to drag out something that isn't working anymore. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned to look at him one last time. Of course, Thomas. I completely understand. Some relationships just run their course. What Thomas didn't understand was that I had no intention of accepting his dismissive terms or disappearing quietly into whatever small life he thought I deserved. He had made the critical mistake of underestimating me, of assuming that 40 years of loyalty and support had made me weak and dependent rather than strong and knowledgeable. Over the next 2 weeks, while Thomas believed I was making arrangements to leave quietly, I was actually conducting the most important research project of my life. I met with Daniel Hayes, the best divorce attorney in Riverside Heights, and learned exactly what my legal rights were and what I could expect from divorce proceedings. I met with financial advisors and business consultants, exploring options I had never considered before. Most importantly, I began reaching out to contacts I had developed over 4 decades in the construction industry. Suppliers who had worked with Morrison and Associates for years. Subcontractors who had built relationships with me personally. Former employees who had moved on to other companies but still respected my business acumen. Even competitors who knew my reputation and had always wondered why I wasn't running my own company. What I discovered was both validating and empowering. People in the industry knew who I was and what I had contributed to Morrison and Associates' success. They respected my judgment, trusted my integrity, and many of them were surprised to learn that I wasn't actually an owner of the company I had helped build. Linda, I always assumed you and Thomas were equal partners, said Marcus Chen, who supplied concrete for most of our commercial projects. You were the one who negotiated our contracts and made sure payments were processed on time. Thomas was the face of the company, but you were the brains behind the operation. Similar conversations with other industry contacts revealed that my professional reputation was separate from and in many ways superior to Thomas's. While Thomas was seen as a competent contractor with good political connections, I was viewed as the detail-oriented professional who made sure projects were completed on time and within budget. This feedback gave me the confidence to pursue the audacious plan that had been forming in my mind since that night when Thomas casually dismissed 40 years of my contributions as legally irrelevant. If Thomas thought he could build Morrison and Associates without me, he was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The construction industry in Riverside Heights was relatively small and tightly connected. Word traveled fast when relationships changed or new opportunities emerged. By carefully nurturing my professional network and exploring partnership possibilities, I began to envision a future that didn't involve quietly accepting whatever crumbs Thomas was willing to throw me. Instead, I began to see a future where I would have the chance to prove that my contributions to Morrison and Associates hadn't been just supportive, they had been essential. Thomas was about to learn that the woman he was discarding so casually was not only capable of surviving without him, but of thriving in ways that would make him question every assumption he had made about our partnership. The pieces of my plan were coming together, but I needed more time to execute it properly, so I continued to play the role of the grieving, defeated wife, allowing Thomas to believe that I was accepting his terms and preparing to fade quietly into whatever diminished life he thought I deserved. What Thomas didn't realize was that I was no longer the same woman who had discovered his affair 3 weeks earlier. That woman had been devastated, heartbroken, and uncertain about her future. The woman I was becoming was angry, determined, and absolutely committed to showing Thomas Morrison exactly what he was losing when he decided to throw away 40 years of partnership for a fling with his secretary. The game was about to begin, in earnest, and I intended to play by rules that Thomas had never imagined existed. The breakthrough came during my 4th meeting with Daniel Hayes, my divorce attorney. We were reviewing the financial documents I had gathered from Thomas's office when Daniel stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he studied a particular contract. "Linda, look at this partnership agreement Thomas signed with Riverside Development Group last year," he said, sliding the document across his desk. "Do you see anything unusual about the terms?" I studied the contract carefully, my years of experience with Morrison and Associates financial documents making the irregularities immediately apparent. "The payment structure is completely backwards," I said slowly. "Riverside Development is paying Morrison and Associates a substantial upfront fee, but they're also retaining rights to terminate the contract at any point in the first 18 months, with full refund of fees paid." Daniel nodded grimly. "Which means Morrison and Associates has essentially provided Riverside Development with an 18-month interest-free loan disguised as a construction contract. If Riverside Development exercises their termination clause, your husband's company will have to refund over $2 million that they've presumably already spent on project startup costs." The implications hit me like a thunderbolt. Thomas had committed Morrison and Associates to a deal that could potentially bankrupt the company if the client decided to withdraw. Even worse, he had done so without consulting me, despite my 40 years of experience evaluating contract risks and financial projections. "There's more," Daniel continued, pulling out another set of documents. "I've been doing some research on Riverside Development Group, and their financial backing is questionable at best. They're a shell company created 18 months ago with minimal capitalization and no track record of completing major construction projects." My blood ran cold as I realized what Daniel was suggesting. "You think this might be a fraudulent operation?" "I think your husband may have been so distracted by his personal situation that he failed to conduct proper due diligence on what could be the largest contract in Morrison and Associates history," Daniel replied carefully. And if this deal goes south, it could take the entire company down with it. I spent the rest of that meeting reviewing every detail of the Riverside development contract, and the more I learned, the more convinced I became that Thomas had made a catastrophic business decision. The warning signs were everywhere, from the unusual payment terms to the lack of proper insurance documentation to the absence of any meaningful financial guarantees from the client. This was exactly the kind of deal I would have refused to approve during my years managing the company's contracts and financial planning. Thomas knew better than to accept such risky terms, which meant his judgment had been seriously compromised by his personal entanglements. Ashley's influence on his decision-making process was apparently extending far beyond their romantic relationship. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Thomas about the Riverside development contract, I chose to use this information strategically. If Thomas was determined to destroy our marriage and dismiss my contributions to Morrison and Associates, then perhaps it was time for him to experience the consequences of running the company without my input and oversight. I began documenting everything I could find about the Riverside development deal, building a comprehensive file that detailed every red flag and questionable decision. I also started reaching out to my contacts in the construction industry, carefully, probing for information about Riverside Development Group and their reputation among suppliers and subcontractors. What I discovered was even worse than I had feared. Riverside Development had attempted similar deals with 3 other construction companies in the Pacific Northwest over the past 2 years. In each case, they had paid substantial upfront fees, demanded extensive preliminary work, and then exercised their termination clauses just before major construction was scheduled to begin. The pattern was so consistent that it was clearly intentional fraud rather than simple business incompetence. "They're running a sophisticated scam," explained Margaret Chen, a business consultant who specialized in construction industry fraud. I had met Maggie through my volunteer work at the medical center, where she helped elderly patients who had been victims of financial scams. They target successful construction companies, offer lucrative contracts with attractive upfront payments, and then disappear with the money after the contractor has invested heavily in project preparation. Maggie agreed to help me investigate Riverside Development Group more thoroughly, and what we uncovered was staggering in its scope and audacity. The company was connected to at least a dozen similar fraudulent operations across the western United States, all following the same pattern of targeting established construction companies with contracts that were too good to be true. "Your husband's company isn't just at risk of losing $2 million, Maggie warned me during one of our investigative meetings. If Riverside Development Group disappears as expected, Morrison and Associates will also be liable for millions more in commitments to subcontractors, suppliers, and equipment leasing companies. The total exposure could be $8 to $10 million. The numbers were devastating. Morrison and Associates, despite its success and solid reputation, simply didn't have the financial resources to absorb that kind of loss. If the Riverside development deal collapsed as expected, it would destroy the company that Thomas and I had spent 40 years building together. For a moment, I felt a surge of panic and protective instinct. This was still my life's work, regardless of how Thomas was treating me personally. The thought of watching Morrison and Associates be destroyed by fraud was almost unbearable, like watching your child be harmed by a predator. But then I remembered Thomas's casual dismissal of my contributions, his assumption that I would quietly accept whatever scraps he was willing to offer me in our divorce, and his apparent belief that he could run the company successfully without my input or oversight. If Thomas was so confident in his ability to manage Morrison and Associates independently, then perhaps he should have the opportunity to prove it. I made the hardest decision of my professional life. Instead of warning Thomas about the fraud I had uncovered, I chose to let events play out naturally while I prepared my own contingency plans. If Thomas wanted to exclude me from the business we had built together, then he could also accept full responsibility for the consequences of his decisions. This decision required me to think strategically about my own future in ways I had never contemplated before. For 40 years, my professional identity had been tied to Morrison and Associates and my partnership with Thomas. Now I needed to envision a future where I could succeed independently, using the skills and relationships I had developed over 4 decades in the construction industry. The solution came to me during a conversation with Brandon Cooper, who had been Thomas's business partner for several major commercial projects over the years. Brandon owned Cooper Construction, a smaller but highly respected company that specialized in residential developments and small commercial projects. "Linda, I've always wondered why you never started your own company," Brandon said over lunch at a downtown restaurant. "You have more industry knowledge and better relationships with suppliers than most contractors who've been in business for decades. If you ever decide to strike out on your own, I'd be interested in discussing partnership opportunities." The seed of an idea began to form in my mind. What if I didn't just start over after my divorce? What if I used this crisis as an opportunity to build something better, something that truly reflected my capabilities and vision for the construction industry? Over the next several weeks, I began quietly exploring the possibility of starting my own construction company. I met with potential investors, researched licensing requirements, and evaluated office space options. I also began having confidential conversations with some of Morrison and Associates' best employees, gauging their interest in joining a new venture if the opportunity arose. What I discovered was both exciting and validating. The construction industry in Riverside Heights was ripe for a new player, especially one with my experience and reputation. Several suppliers offered to extend credit terms to any company I might start, based on our long-standing business relationships. Former Morrison and Associates employees expressed interest in working for me again, citing their respect for my management, style, and business acumen. Most surprisingly, I learned that several major clients had specifically requested to work with me on their projects, assuming that I was a decision-maker at Morrison and Associates, rather than just Thomas's wife. When Marcus Chen at Pacific Concrete learned that I was considering starting my own company, he immediately offered to become a founding investor. "Linda, the construction industry needs more companies run by people who understand both the technical and financial aspects of the business," Marcus explained during one of our meetings. "You've proven over 40 years that you can manage complex projects while maintaining profitability and client satisfaction. I'd be honored to back your new venture." The financial backing was coming together more easily than I had dared to hope. Between Marcus's investment offer, my own savings, and the divorce settlement I expected to receive, I would have enough capital to launch a substantial construction company. More importantly, I was building a network of supporters who believed in my capabilities and were willing to bet their own money on my success. Meanwhile, the Riverside development situation was developing exactly as Maggie and I had predicted. The company had been making increasingly unreasonable demands on Morrison and Associates, requiring extensive design changes and additional preliminary work, while providing vague explanations about financing delays and permit issues. Thomas was becoming visibly stressed about the project, though he was trying to hide his concerns from the staff. I observed him during my occasional visits to the office, noting the tension in his shoulders and the worried expression he wore when he thought no one was looking. Ashley seemed to be offering emotional support, but she lacked the business experience to provide meaningful advice about managing such a complex and problematic client relationship. The first major red flag came when Riverside Development requested a significant change to the construction timeline, pushing back the start date by 6 months while maintaining all of their termination rights under the original contract. This modification would extend Morrison and Associates' financial exposure while providing no additional security or compensation. Thomas called a staff meeting to discuss the timeline change, and I attended as I always had when major client issues needed to be addressed. Watching him try to put a positive spin on clearly problematic developments was both painful and enlightening. The Thomas I had married 40 years earlier would never have accepted such obviously unfavorable terms, but his judgment was clearly compromised by stress and distraction. Riverside Development is dealing with some complex financing issues, but they've assured me that the project will move forward as planned," Thomas told the assembled staff. "The timeline adjustment actually gives us more time to perfect our preparation work and ensure a smooth construction process." Several of the senior employees exchanged skeptical glances, clearly recognizing the warning signs that Thomas was either ignoring or failing to acknowledge. After the meeting, I was approached by Janet Rodriguez, our longtime bookkeeper, who had concerns about the project's financial implications. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been reviewing the Riverside Development contract, and I'm worried about our cash flow projections," Janet said quietly. "If they exercise their termination clause, we'll be in serious financial trouble. Have you and Mr. Morrison discussed contingency plans?" The question put me in an impossible position. Janet was looking to me for the kind of financial oversight and strategic planning I had provided for decades, but Thomas had made it clear that my input was no longer welcome or legally relevant. I was caught between my loyalty to the employees, who had worked with me for years, and my recognition that Thomas had chosen to exclude me from business decisions. "Janet, you should discuss your concerns directly with Thomas," I said carefully. "He's the one making the strategic decisions about this project." Janet's expression showed that she understood the subtext of my response. She had worked at Morrison & Associates long enough to know that I would normally be deeply involved in analyzing and mitigating such significant financial risks. My deferral to Thomas was a clear signal that something fundamental had changed in the company's decision-making structure. Over the following days, I noticed similar conversations between other employees and Thomas. The staff was becoming increasingly nervous about the Riverside Development project, but Thomas was dismissing their concerns and insisting that everything was under control. His unwillingness to acknowledge the problems was creating tension throughout the organization and undermining confidence in his leadership. The breaking point came during the last week of April, exactly 2 months after I had discovered Thomas's affair with Ashley. Riverside Development Group suddenly announced that they were exercising their termination clause, citing unforeseen financial complications that made it impossible to proceed with the construction project. The termination notice was delivered on a Friday afternoon, just as most of the staff was preparing to leave for the weekend. Thomas was out of the office, supposedly meeting with another client, so the notice was received by Ashley, who immediately called him in a panic. I was in the office reviewing some final details related to my own business planning when Ashley took the call. I watched her face go pale as she listened to Thomas's response, clearly hearing news that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the Riverside Development project. "Yes, Mr. Morrison, I understand," Ashley said into the phone, her voice shaking. "I'll start calling the subcontractors right away to let them know about the delay." She paused, listening. "No, sir, I don't think Mrs. Morrison is in the office today." But I was in the office, sitting just 20 feet away, watching the beginning of Morrison & Associates' financial crisis unfold in real time. Ashley hadn't seen me because I was in the conference room with the door partially closed, but I could hear every word of her conversation with Thomas. After Ashley hung up, I watched her sit at her desk for several long minutes, staring at her computer screen with an expression of complete overwhelm. She was clearly out of her depth, lacking the experience and knowledge needed to manage the crisis that was about to engulf Morrison & Associates. For a moment, I felt sympathy for Ashley. She was young, inexperienced, and had been thrust into a situation that would challenge even the most seasoned business professional. Her affair with Thomas had probably seemed exciting and romantic, but now she was facing the reality of what it meant to be involved with a business owner facing potential bankruptcy. I also felt a final pang of regret for Morrison & Associates, and all the employees who would be affected by Thomas's poor decisions. These were people I had worked with for years, people whose families depended on their jobs, people who had trusted Thomas and me to make sound business decisions that would ensure the company's long-term stability. But my regret was tempered by the recognition that this crisis was entirely preventable. Thomas had ignored obvious warning signs, dismissed the concerns of experienced employees, and excluded the person who had helped him successfully navigate business challenges for 40 years. The consequences he was now facing were the direct result of his choices, both personal and professional. As I quietly gathered my things and prepared to leave the office, I made a final decision about my response to Morrison and Associates' crisis. I would not intervene to save the company, but I would make sure that the employees who had been loyal to me over the years had opportunities to land on their feet. Over the weekend, I began making calls to construction companies throughout the Pacific Northwest, recommending specific Morrison and Associates employees for positions that I knew were available. My reputation in the industry made these recommendations carry significant weight, and by Monday morning, I had secured job interviews for 8 of the company's most valuable employees. I also began finalizing the paperwork for my own construction company, which I had decided to name Morrison Construction Services. The name was both a tribute to my 40 years of work in the industry and a subtle message to Thomas about what he was losing when he chose to discard our partnership. The irony was perfect. Thomas had assumed that Morrison and Associates was his company because his name was on the incorporation papers, but he had forgotten that Morrison was my name too. If he wanted to exclude me from the business we had built together, then perhaps it was time for me to show him what Morrison really meant in the construction industry of Riverside Heights. The pieces of my plan were finally coming together, and Thomas Morrison was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his business: career. The woman he had dismissed as legally irrelevant was about to demonstrate that 40 years of industry experience, professional relationships, and business acumen couldn't be dismissed quite so easily. The real game was about to begin, and this time I would be playing to win everything. The launch of Morrison Construction Services happened faster than I had ever imagined possible. Within 2 weeks of the Riverside development collapse, I had secured office space in a modern building just 6 blocks from Thomas's headquarters, hired 4 of his former employees, and signed contracts with 3 major suppliers who had been waiting years for an alternative to Morrison and Associates in the Riverside Heights market. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. While Thomas was desperately trying to manage the financial crisis that threatened to destroy his company, I was quietly building a competitor that would offer everything Morrison and Associates had provided, but with better management, stronger financial backing, and a reputation for reliability that stretched back 40 years. My first major coup was securing Janet Rodriguez as my chief financial officer. Janet had been Morrison and Associates' bookkeeper for 15 years and knew every detail of Thomas's business operations, client relationships, and financial vulnerabilities. When I offered her a 20% salary increase and profit-sharing opportunities, she didn't hesitate to accept. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been waiting for this opportunity for years," Janet told me as she signed her employment contract. "Working for you again feels like coming home. Mr. Morrison never understood the financial side of the business the way you do." Janet's defection was particularly devastating to Thomas because she had been handling all of the complex paperwork related to the Riverside development disaster. Without her institutional knowledge and attention to detail, Thomas was struggling to even understand the full scope of his company's financial exposure, let alone develop strategies for managing it. The second key hire was David Park, Morrison and Associates' former project manager, who had been responsible for some of their most successful commercial developments. David had grown increasingly frustrated with Thomas's erratic decision-making, and Ashley's attempts to insert herself into project management discussions, despite her lack of technical expertise. "Linda, working with Thomas has become impossible," David explained during our interview meeting. "He makes commitments to clients without consulting the project team, changes specifications without considering cost implications, and relies on Ashley for advice about construction details she doesn't understand. I've been looking for an exit strategy for months." David brought with him detailed knowledge of Morrison and Associates' current projects, including insider information about client satisfaction levels and potential contract renewals. More importantly, he had maintained relationships with many of the subcontractors and suppliers who had grown frustrated with Thomas's increasingly unreliable management style. My third strategic hire was Maria Santos, a licensed architect who had been working as an independent consultant but was interested in joining a construction company that could offer integrated design and building services. Maria had worked on several projects with Morrison and Associates over the years and had always been impressed with my understanding of both the technical and business aspects of construction. "Linda, you're the only person I've met in this industry who truly understands how good design and sound business practices have to work together," Maria said when I offered her the position of Chief Design Officer. Thomas always treated architecture as an afterthought, something to be minimized and rushed through. I'm excited about the possibility of building a company that values both excellent design and successful project delivery. Within 3 weeks of opening Morrison Construction Services, I had assembled a team that combined decades of industry experience with fresh energy and innovative approaches to construction project management. We were lean, efficient, and highly motivated by the opportunity to prove that we could succeed independently of Thomas Morrison's management style. The office space I had chosen was strategically perfect. The building was newer and more impressive than the aging structure that housed Morrison and Associates, with modern conference rooms, high-speed internet infrastructure, and parking that could accommodate both staff and client meetings. The location was convenient to most of our target clients, while being visible enough to make a statement about our professional credibility. I had also invested in technology that Morrison and Associates had never prioritized. We implemented project management software that allowed real-time tracking of schedules, budgets, and material deliveries. We installed video conferencing equipment that made it easy to conduct virtual meetings with clients and subcontractors. Most importantly, we established financial tracking systems that provided daily updates on project profitability and cash flow projections. The contrast with Thomas's operation was stark and deliberate. While Morrison and Associates was still relying on outdated systems and struggling to manage basic administrative functions, Morrison Construction Services was operating with the efficiency and transparency that modern clients expected from their construction partners. My marketing strategy was subtle but devastatingly effective. Instead of directly competing with Morrison and Associates for new clients, I focused on reconnecting with former clients who had worked with me during my years managing Thomas's business operations. Many of these clients had specifically requested my involvement in their projects, not realizing that I wasn't actually an owner or decision-maker at Morrison and Associates. The response was overwhelming and immediate. Patricia Williams, who owned a chain of medical clinics, called me within hours of learning about Morrison Construction Services. "Linda, I've been hoping for years that you would start your own company," she said excitedly. "We have 3 new clinic locations planned for this year, and I want you to handle all of them. When can we meet to discuss specifications and timelines?" Similar calls came from other former Morrison and Associates clients who had been frustrated with the declining quality of service and increasing unreliability of Thomas's operation. Within a month, Morrison Construction Services had signed contracts worth over $4 million, with project timelines extending well into the following year. The most satisfying contract came from Riverside Medical Center, where I had volunteered for years, and where the administration had been planning a major expansion project. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the chief administrator, had originally approached Morrison and Associates about the project, but had been put off by Thomas's dismissive attitude and Ashley's inappropriate attempts to participate in technical discussions. "Linda, we always assumed you were a partner at Morrison and Associates," Dr. Chen explained during our contract negotiation meeting. "When we learned that Thomas had been taking credit for your work all these years, we were appalled. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to work directly with you on this expansion project." The medical center contract was worth over $2 million and included plans for future phases that could double that amount. More importantly, it established Morrison Construction Services as a serious competitor in the commercial construction market, with the credibility and financial backing needed to compete for major projects. Meanwhile, Thomas's situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Riverside development collapse had triggered a cascade of financial problems that were threatening the survival of Morrison and Associates. Subcontractors were demanding payment for work they had completed based on the fraudulent contract. Suppliers were putting the company on credit hold until outstanding invoices were settled, and employees were beginning to look for more stable employment opportunities. Thomas had been forced to take out a substantial loan against the company's assets just to meet payroll and keep the business operating. The interest rates were punitive, reflecting the lender's assessment of Morrison and Associates' financial instability, and the repayment terms were structured in ways that would strain the company's cash flow for years to come. More personally, devastating for Thomas was the growing tension in his relationship with Ashley. The stress of the business crisis was revealing fundamental incompatibilities that had been hidden during their affair's romantic phase. Ashley had expected to step into a comfortable role as the wife of a successful business owner, but instead, she found herself dealing with angry creditors, worried employees, and a man who was increasingly irritable and distracted. I learned about these developments through Janet, who maintained contact with several former colleagues still working at Morrison and Associates. The office atmosphere had become toxic, with Thomas snapping at employees and Ashley trying unsuccessfully to assert authority she didn't have the competence to wield effectively. "Mr. Morrison has aged 10 years in the past 2 months, Janet reported during one of our weekly planning meetings. He's working 18-hour days trying to manage the crisis, but he's making decisions based on panic rather than strategic thinking. Ashley keeps trying to help, but she doesn't understand the business well enough to offer meaningful advice." The contrast with my own situation was stark and deeply satisfying. While Thomas was struggling to save a company that was hemorrhaging money and credibility, I was building a new enterprise that was profitable from its first month of operation. My careful planning, strategic hiring, and focus on client relationships were paying dividends that exceeded even my optimistic projections. The turning point came in late June, exactly 4 months after I had discovered Thomas's affair, and 3 months after launching Morrison Construction Services. Thomas finally realized that his company was facing bankruptcy and that he needed help from someone with the financial expertise to develop a recovery plan. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing project specifications for the medical center expansion. Thomas's voice on the phone was strained and desperate, lacking any trace of the confidence and dismissiveness he had shown during our divorce discussions. "Linda, I need to talk to you about something important," he said without preamble. "It's about the business situation. I think I may have made some mistakes, and I could use your advice about how to handle the financial complications." The irony was breathtaking. The man who had dismissed my contributions as legally irrelevant was now asking for my help to save the company he had claimed was entirely his own creation. The man who had told me I was just a roommate rather than a true partner was now admitting that he needed the business expertise I had been providing for 40 years. "Thomas, I'm very busy with my own company these days," I replied calmly. "Morrison Construction Services has been more successful than I expected, and I'm completely focused on serving my clients and managing my team." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Your own company?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Morrison Construction Services," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "I launched it 3 months ago. We're already booking projects well into next year, and we've hired several excellent people who were looking for more stable employment opportunities." Another long pause. "Linda, we need to talk about this situation. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning? There are some things we need to discuss." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," I replied. "As I mentioned, I'm completely focused on my own business now. If you need financial advice, I'd recommend consulting with a professional business consultant or bankruptcy attorney." The word bankruptcy hung in the air between us like a sword. Thomas knew that I knew exactly how dire his situation had become, and he also knew that I was the one person who had the knowledge and relationships needed to help him navigate the crisis. "Linda, please," Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I made mistakes with our marriage, but we can't let 40 years of work just disappear. The company employs 23 people. Their families depend on those jobs." The appeal to my loyalty and compassion was both transparent and effective. Despite everything Thomas had done to me personally, I still cared about the employees who had worked loyally for Morrison and Associates over the years. The thought of 23 families losing their income because of Thomas's poor judgment was genuinely painful. But I also recognized that Thomas was trying to manipulate me into saving him from the consequences of his own decisions. He had excluded me from the business when he thought he didn't need my help, and now he was trying to exploit my compassion when he realized he couldn't manage the crisis alone. "Thomas, you made it very clear during our divorce discussions that Morrison and Associates was your company and that my contributions were not legally relevant," I said firmly. "You can't dismiss me as a partner when things are going well, and then expect me to act like a partner when you need help managing problems you created." "I was angry and said things I didn't mean," Thomas protested. "You know how much you contributed to building this company. You know I couldn't have done it without you. Actually, you told me that you had done it without me, that my name wasn't on any of the important documents, and that I deserved whatever scraps the divorce court decided to give me," I reminded him. "You also told me that our marriage had been over for years, and that I had become more like a roommate than a wife." Thomas was quiet for so long that I wondered if he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Linda, I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. I was scared and confused, and I handled the whole situation terribly. Can we please meet and talk about how to move forward?" The apology was 40 years too late and several $1 million short of sufficient. But it did represent the first time Thomas had acknowledged that his treatment of me had been wrong. It was also clear that his apology was motivated more by desperation than by genuine remorse, but it was still more accountability than I had ever expected to hear from him. "Thomas, I appreciate the apology, but I'm not interested in revisiting our personal relationship or our business partnership," I said. "I'm building something new that reflects my own values and vision for the construction industry. I hope you're able to find a way to resolve your current difficulties, but that's not my responsibility anymore." After I hung up, I sat in my home office for a long time, thinking about the conversation and the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I had been a woman whose entire identity was tied to her role as Thomas Morrison's wife and business partner. I had believed that my value was determined by my usefulness to someone else's dreams and ambitions. Now I was Linda Morrison, successful business owner, employer of talented professionals, and respected member of the Riverside Heights construction community. I had built something that was entirely my own, something that reflected my standards for excellence, integrity, and client service. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that my contributions to Morrison and Associates hadn't been just supportive. They had been essential. The phone rang again later that evening. This time it was Ashley Rodriguez, calling from what I assumed was her personal phone rather than the Morrison and Associates office line. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Ashley," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to ask you something important." I was tempted to hang up immediately, but curiosity got the better of me. "What is it, Ashley?" "Is it true that you started your own construction company?" she asked. "Is that why so many people have been quitting Morrison and Associates recently?" "I started Morrison Construction Services because I needed to build a future for myself after my husband decided to end our marriage," I replied evenly. The fact that experienced construction professionals are choosing to work for my company rather than staying at Morrison and Associates suggests that they prefer working in a more stable and professionally managed environment. Ashley was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. The situation with Mr. Morrison, it just developed gradually, and I didn't realize how much damage it would cause to everyone involved. The explanation was pathetic in its inadequacy, but I could hear genuine distress in Ashley's voice. She was beginning to understand that her affair with Thomas hadn't just destroyed a marriage. It had set in motion a series of events that were destroying the company and threatening the livelihoods of everyone who worked there. Ashley, you're a young woman and you made some poor choices, but Thomas is a grown man who was responsible for his own decisions, I said. The problems at Morrison and Associates aren't just about personal relationships. They're about business, judgment, financial management, and professional competence. Is there anything that can be done to save the company? Ashley asked desperately. Mr. Morrison is talking about bankruptcy, and I'm scared about what that means for everyone who works here. For a moment, I felt genuine sympathy for Ashley. She was in her early 30s, had limited business experience, and had gotten involved in a situation that was far more complex and destructive than she had ever imagined. Her call was probably motivated by guilt and fear rather than calculation, and she genuinely seemed to care about the fate of Morrison and Associates employees. Ashley, Morrison and Associates' problems are the result of poor business decisions that were made over a period of months, I explained. Saving the company would require not just financial resources, but also fundamental changes in management practices and decision-making processes. At this point, I'm not sure that's possible. The conversation ended with Ashley thanking me for being willing to talk with her and expressing hope that somehow the situation could be resolved without destroying the livelihoods of innocent employees. After hanging up, I realized that both Thomas and Ashley were beginning to understand the full scope of what they had lost when they chose to pursue their affair at the expense of everything else. But understanding the consequences and being able to fix them were two entirely different things. Morrison and Associates was facing financial problems that couldn't be solved with apologies or regret. The company needed massive capital infusion, complete management restructuring, and several years of rebuilding client relationships and market credibility. More fundamentally, Thomas had proven that he lacked the judgment and stability needed to run a major construction company. His personal crisis had compromised his professional competence in ways that couldn't be easily corrected. Even if he managed to avoid bankruptcy, Morrison and Associates would never again be the respected industry leader it had been during the years when I was actively involved in its management. As I prepared for bed that evening, I reflected on how completely the situation had reversed in just 6 months. Thomas had started the year believing he could discard me and continue enjoying the success we had built together. Now he was facing the possibility of losing everything while I was building a new company that was exceeding all of my expectations for growth and profitability. The woman Thomas had dismissed as legally irrelevant was now his most successful competitor. The partnership he had considered dispensable was proving to have been the foundation of everything he had achieved. The wife he had replaced with a younger model was demonstrating that 40 years of experience and professional relationships couldn't be replicated or replaced. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for Morrison Construction Services, new projects to manage and new clients to serve. But tonight, I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point, and excited about the future I was building for myself. Thomas Morrison was learning the hard way that some partnerships can't be broken without destroying everything they had created together. I was learning that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always meant to be. The final chapter of this story began on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I had discovered Thomas's affair with Ashley. I was standing in the conference room of Morrison Construction Services, looking out at the bustling construction site where our team was putting the finishing touches on the Riverside Medical Center expansion project. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. 1 year ago, I had been a woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in someone else's dreams and accomplishments. Today, I was watching my own team complete a $2 million project that bore my company's name and reflected my standards for excellence and integrity. Dr. Elizabeth Chen had stopped by for a progress inspection, and her satisfaction with our work was evident in every comment she made. "Linda, this project has exceeded every expectation we had," she said, watching our crew install the final pieces of exterior signage. "The attention to detail, the adherence to timeline, the communication throughout the process, everything has been exactly what we hoped for when we decided to work with Morrison Construction Services." The medical center project had become our showcase, demonstrating to the entire Riverside Heights business community that Morrison Construction Services wasn't just another startup construction company, but a serious competitor with the expertise and resources to handle major commercial projects. Word of our success had spread quickly, and my phone was ringing daily with inquiries from potential clients who wanted to work with a company that delivered on its promises. More satisfying than the professional recognition was the personal transformation I had undergone during the past year. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as Thomas Morrison's wife and business partner had evolved into Linda Morrison, respected business owner and community leader. I had rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant for decades, and I had developed new capabilities I never knew I possessed. The team I had assembled at Morrison Construction Services had become more than just employees. They had become collaborators in building something meaningful and lasting. Janet Rodriguez had proven to be not just an excellent financial manager, but also a strategic thinker, who helped me identify new market opportunities and develop innovative service offerings. David Park had brought his project management expertise and expanded it into comprehensive client relationship management that was setting new standards in our industry. Maria Santos had exceeded every expectation I had for integrating architectural services with construction management. Her ability to work with clients on design modifications while maintaining budget and timeline constraints had become one of our company's most distinctive competitive advantages. Together, we had created a construction company that offered the kind of comprehensive professional service that clients had been seeking but rarely finding in the Riverside Heights market. The success of Morrison Construction Services had also created opportunities for me to give back to the community in ways that had been impossible when I was focused solely on supporting Thomas's business. I had established a scholarship program for women pursuing careers in construction and engineering, partnering with the local community college to provide both financial support and mentorship opportunities for students who might not otherwise have access to industry connections. I had also become active in the Riverside Heights Chamber of Commerce, serving on the Economic Development Committee and helping to attract new businesses to our community. The respect I had earned as a successful business owner had given me a platform to advocate for policies that supported small business growth and workforce development. These community involvement activities had brought me into contact with other successful women who had built their own companies and careers. For the first time in my adult life, I had friendships that were based on shared professional interests and mutual respect, rather than social obligations or community volunteer work. The relationships were energizing and inspiring in ways that reminded me how much of myself I had submerged during my years of marriage to Thomas. Meanwhile, the situation at Morrison & Associates had continued to deteriorate throughout the year. Thomas had been forced to lay off more than half of his workforce, sell equipment to meet loan payments, and accept contracts at below-market rates just to keep the company operating. The stress had taken a visible toll on his health and appearance, aging him in ways that made it hard to believe he was only 2 years older than me. Ashley had left Morrison & Associates in August, ostensibly to pursue other opportunities, but actually because the company could no longer afford her salary. Her departure had been particularly painful for Thomas because it came just as he was beginning to realize how much he had sacrificed for a relationship that was based more on fantasy than on genuine compatibility. I learned about these developments through the construction industry grapevine, which was small enough that major changes at any company quickly became common knowledge. My success with Morrison Construction Services had made me a popular topic of conversation at industry events, and people seemed eager to share information about how Thomas was handling the competition from his former wife. The most detailed update came from Marcus Chen, who had remained friendly with both Thomas and me despite the awkwardness of our situation. Marcus had been trying to help Thomas develop a business recovery plan, but he was finding it difficult to work with someone whose judgment had been so compromised by personal and financial stress. Linda, I've tried to help Thomas restructure his debt and develop a realistic business plan, but he's not thinking clearly about his options, Marcus explained during one of our regular lunch meetings. He's still hoping that somehow Morrison and Associates can return to its former success, but he doesn't seem to understand that the construction industry has moved on. Clients want the kind of professional service and reliability that you're providing, not the chaos and uncertainty that has become associated with his company. Marcus's assessment confirmed what I had suspected about Thomas's situation. The financial crisis at Morrison and Associates wasn't just a temporary setback that could be resolved with better management or additional capital. It was the logical consequence of fundamental problems with Thomas's approach to business operations and client relationships. The breaking point came in early November when Thomas was forced to declare bankruptcy for Morrison and Associates. The announcement appeared in the local business journal, marking the official end of a company that had once been one of Riverside Heights' most respected construction firms. The bankruptcy filing listed debts of over $12 million against assets that were worth less than $4 million at liquidation values. Reading the bankruptcy notice was one of the most complex emotional experiences of my life. Part of me felt genuine sadness for the death of something that had been such a significant part of my identity for so many years. Morrison and Associates represented 40 years of my life, 40 years of work and dreams and shared accomplishments that had now been reduced to a legal document listing creditors and liquidation schedules. But another part of me felt a deep sense of vindication and closure. Thomas had dismissed my contributions as legally irrelevant and assumed that he could continue to enjoy the success we had built together while discarding the partner who had made that success possible. The bankruptcy of Morrison and Associates was proof that my contributions hadn't been optional or replaceable. They had been essential to everything the company had achieved. The human cost of the bankruptcy was significant and genuinely painful to contemplate. 23 employees lost their jobs, some of them people who had worked for Morrison and Associates for over a decade. Subcontractors and suppliers were left with unpaid invoices that would never be collected. Clients with ongoing projects were forced to find new contractors and absorb the costs of starting over with different companies. I did what I could to help the displaced employees find new positions, using my industry connections to identify opportunities and provide recommendations for people who had worked loyally for Thomas, despite the company's deteriorating management. Several of the former Morrison and Associates employees eventually joined Morrison Construction Services, bringing with them valuable experience and institutional knowledge that strengthened our capabilities. The personal reckoning between Thomas and me came 3 weeks after the bankruptcy filing when he called to request a meeting. His voice on the phone was different from any conversation we had ever had. Quieter, more reflective, and completely free of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized his communications during our divorce proceedings. "Linda, I know I have no right to ask this, but I need to talk with you about what happened," Thomas said. "Not about business or money or legal issues, but about us and the choices I made that destroyed everything we had built together." I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that was convenient but not associated with either of our companies or our personal history. When Thomas arrived, I was shocked by how much he had changed in the month since I had last seen him. He had lost weight, his hair had gone completely gray, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was carrying a heavy burden. "Linda, I need to start by saying that I'm sorry," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just sorry for the affair or for the things I said during our divorce, but sorry for 40 years of taking you for granted and failing to appreciate what you brought to our partnership." The apology was more comprehensive than anything I had expected to hear from Thomas, but it was also coming far too late to change anything meaningful about our situation. I listened without interrupting as he continued. "I've spent the past year trying to understand how I could have been so blind to what I was throwing away," Thomas said. "Watching you build Morrison Construction Services, seeing how quickly you attracted clients and employees and respect in the industry, it made me realize that I never really understood what made Morrison and Associates successful." He paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions that had been tormenting him. "I thought I was the visionary, the leader, the one who made everything happen. But you were the one who made sure everything actually worked. You were the one who maintained relationships, managed finances, solved problems, and kept the company grounded in reality while I was focused on the next big opportunity." Thomas looked up at me with an expression of genuine bewilderment. How did I not see that? How did I convince myself that I could succeed without you? The question was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Thomas was finally acknowledging truths that should have been obvious to him decades earlier, but his recognition was coming only after he had lost everything and had no choice but to confront reality. "Thomas, I don't think you were deliberately trying to diminish my contributions," I said carefully, "but I think you got caught up in a narrative about yourself that didn't leave room for acknowledging how much you depended on other people's work and support." He nodded sadly. "The affair with Ashley was the symptom, not the disease. The real problem was that I had started believing my own publicity, thinking that I was the sole reason for our success, and that everyone else was just supporting my vision." Thomas took a deep breath before continuing. "Ashley was young and impressed by what she saw as my accomplishments, and being with her made me feel like the successful, powerful man I wanted to believe I was. But she didn't know me well enough to challenge my assumptions or call me out when I was making stupid decisions." The insight was accurate but painful to hear. Thomas was essentially admitting that he had chosen Ashley over me because she reflected back an image of himself that was more flattering than the truth. He had preferred the fantasy of being a self-made success story to the reality of being part of a successful partnership. "What are you going to do now?" I asked, genuinely curious about how Thomas planned to rebuild his life after losing everything he had worked for. "I'm not sure yet," Thomas admitted. "I'm 64 years old, I have no significant assets, and my reputation in the construction industry is pretty much destroyed. I've been thinking about leaving Riverside Heights, maybe moving somewhere where I can start over without the constant reminder of what I used to have." The thought of Thomas leaving town was both sad and liberating. On one hand, he had been part of my life for over 40 years, and imagining Riverside Heights without him felt like the end of an era. On the other hand, his departure would eliminate the awkwardness of running into him at industry events and community functions. "Thomas, you're not the first successful person to make mistakes that cost them everything," I said. "If you're genuinely committed to learning from what happened and rebuilding your life differently, there are opportunities for second chances." He looked at me with surprise. "Are you saying you might consider working together again someday?" The question revealed that Thomas still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what he had lost or the impossibility of returning to our former relationship. The partnership we had shared for 40 years was gone forever, destroyed not just by his affair, but by his fundamental failure to value and respect my contributions. "Thomas, I'm saying that you're a talented person who made some terrible choices, but that doesn't mean your entire future has to be defined by those mistakes," I replied. "However, our partnership is over permanently. I've built something new that reflects my own values and vision, and I'm not interested in looking backward." We talked for another hour, covering topics ranging from our early years together to the lessons we had learned from the collapse of our marriage and business partnership. Thomas asked about my new company and seemed genuinely proud of what I had accomplished, though his pride was mixed with regret for what he had lost. As we prepared to leave, Thomas made one final statement that surprised me with its insight and maturity. "Linda, I want you to know that I understand now why you couldn't warn me about the Riverside development problems or try to save Morrison and Associates from bankruptcy. You had already given me 40 years of your expertise and dedication, and I had rejected it all in favor of pursuing a fantasy with Ashley. You didn't owe me anything more." The acknowledgement was both painful and healing. Thomas was finally taking full responsibility for the consequences of his choices, without trying to make me responsible for rescuing him from problems he had created. 6 months later, I received a postcard from Thomas, who had moved to Colorado, and was working as a project supervisor for a small construction company near Denver. The card was brief but genuine, expressing his continued regret for the pain he had caused and his happiness at hearing about the continued success of Morrison Construction Services. By that time, my company had grown to 15 employees and was booking over $10 million in annual revenue. We had completed 12 major projects and had contracts extending 2 years into the future. More importantly, we had established a reputation for excellence and reliability that was attracting attention from clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. The medical center expansion had led to additional contracts with healthcare providers, who were impressed with our ability to work in occupied facilities without disrupting patient care. Our success with that challenging project had demonstrated capabilities that few construction companies could match, opening up new market opportunities that were both lucrative and professionally satisfying. I had also become something of a role model for other women in the construction industry, speaking at conferences and mentoring younger professionals who were trying to build careers in a traditionally male-dominated field. The visibility was sometimes uncomfortable for someone who had spent 40 years working behind the scenes, but I recognized the importance of showing other women that success was possible even after major life disruptions. As I approached my 64th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 2 years earlier, I had been a woman whose entire identity was built around supporting someone else's dreams and achievements. I had accepted a secondary role in my own life, believing that my value came from being useful to Thomas, rather than from my own capabilities and accomplishments. The betrayal that had initially seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of the most fulfilling and successful period of my life. Being forced to rebuild from scratch had given me the opportunity to create something that truly reflected my values, my standards, and my vision for what a construction company could be. Morrison Construction Services wasn't just a business. It was proof that 40 years of experience, dedication, and expertise couldn't be dismissed or discarded. It was evidence that partnerships built on respect and mutual appreciation were more valuable than relationships based on convenience or fantasy. Most importantly, it was demonstration that it's never too late to discover who you really are and what you're truly capable of achieving. Thomas had thought he could throw away our partnership and continue enjoying the success we had built together. Instead, he had learned that some contributions can't be replaced and some relationships can't be broken without destroying everything they had created. The woman he had dismissed as legally irrelevant had proven to be the foundation of everything he had achieved. As for me, I had learned that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't revenge or anger, but simply becoming the person you were, always meant to be. I had discovered that strength I didn't know I possessed, capabilities I had never fully developed, and dreams I had never allowed myself to pursue. The construction industry of Riverside Heights would never forget the year that Linda Morrison bought her husband's company without telling him, not by purchasing Morrison and Associates, but by building something better and proving that the expertise he had taken for granted was worth far more than he had ever imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.